Jim Monahan with you this Sunday morning on Jersey Magazine. And my guest is author of a brand new book, Like Literally, Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. Valerie Fridland, good morning and welcome to WDHA.
Well, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
There's a Paul Simon song. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. The name of the song is The Boy in the Bubble. And there's a lyric in that song, Valerie: every generation throws a hero up the pop charts. And as I was reading through the book, that line in the song came to my mind because all I could think of is every generation at some point or another butchers the English language.
That's exactly what people tell me. And I think that's part of the reason I wanted to write the book, to set the record straight about what we mean when we talk about butchering the language. But I think you should sing me a few bars from that song and I might remember it.
You definitely know it if you heard it. And you say in the book that our speech says a lot more about us than we probably realize. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that speech is about not just communicating information, it's about communicating identity and views and stances and relationships. And all of that gets done in very subconscious ways that we don't even realize. So a really quick example is the shift between the ing and the in ending on verbs. So walk in versus walking, talk in versus talking. What's fascinating is how we shift using those depending on our context. So if I'm in a very formal meeting or I'm giving a presentation, I'm going to ing. But when I'm hanging out at the bar with my friends, if I ing, they're going to leave because it communicates solidarity, closeness, and intimacy. But not only that, if we're arguing with someone, guess which one we use more of? Ing, because it also communicates authority and social distance. But when we're joking with each other, we shift to more in. So these are very subtle patterns that we have in our language use where we're communicating information about the situation and our relationship. But also we find that women tend to ing while men in more. Lower classes tend to in while upper classes tend to ing more. And we also find that sometimes when we're talking about adolescents, some studies have suggested that those that have more model behavior, so the good kids in school, the ones that you don't hang out with because they're no fun, they ing, whereas the sort of more disruptive, laid back kids in more. So we see all these aspects of personality conveyed by one tiny little ending. So think about how many different endings you have on your speech, how many different vowels you can say things with, and you have a lot of ways to communicate social as well as linguistic information.
You mentioned vowels and, of course, A, E, I, O, U, sometimes Y, and you point out in the book that it's beyond those A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y because of all of the different combinations that lead to different sounds.
Absolutely. You know, this idea that we have just 5 vowels and maybe a toss away Y here and there is really based on sort of these ideas that we have based on writing. We use 5 vowels to represent 12 to 14 vowels that English has, depending on which dialect you speak. And that's obviously a lot more than 5, which is why we have all these funky ways of writing vowels, right? So E can be written with an EO, like in people, but also an EE, like in peep. So, you know, there's all sorts of weird ways we combine these to represent all these different vowel sounds we have. And we think so strongly we have 5 vowels, not because that's the truth about English. It's wrong. We have 12 to 14 vowels that are different sounds that make meaning differences among words. But because of writing being so strongly inscribed in our heads, we think we have 5 vowels. And we find this over and over to be the case. In holding back natural evolutionary changes, we get really tied to the way they're written and therefore don't want to change. But, you know, that ing ending, for example, I mentioned earlier, that's a writing pronunciation. When we look back to the 18th century, pronunciation guides tell us that coughing and coffin should rhyme, as should heron and herring, which suggests it was in at the time, not ing. And it's the G in writing that made us think there was a G on there.
I should point out that in addition to writing the book Like Literally, Dude, Valerie Fridland is a professor of linguistics, the English department at the University of Nevada, Reno. You mentioned just a little while ago about the difference between adolescent girls and boys. And one thing, I'm coaching a high school baseball team for the 4th year now. So I'm around high school kids a lot. Valerie, I can tell you authoritatively that high school girls no longer use the word fudge.
Well, let me say, I have a high school girl, and I'll tell you that not once have I heard fudge come out of her mouth. I won't say what does come out of her mouth, but it's definitely not fudge. No, that's very true. And if we ever want to look at the frontier of language, we just need to look at young people. They are by and far the movers and the shakers of language. And we tend to think of them as leaders in slang, of course. If you look around at the internet, you see tons of evidence of this, of new words introduced by adolescents. But actually, if you look at studies on language change, it always begins with the young because of the intense period of social identity formation they're going through, because of the fact that their brains have more neuroplasticity and are making more neural pathways still when we old farts don't have that advantage anymore. And also because they want to be nothing like their parents, as my teenagers constantly remind me. So you throw those in a blender, and what that produces is language change. And those changes often go on to be the changes of the future. Now, obviously, not whether you're going to say Riz or fudge or the other word, but more substantive changes like going from saying will to going from saying must to have to, and the vowel changes that make cool sound much cooler.
Well, if it's
when you
any
say it the right way.
consolation, your teenagers will eventually turn into their parents, which is what I've done at various points. I think back to my dad, when I would say like, or he'd count them. And it drove me out of my mind. Also, may I versus can. Yes, you can, but you may not. And I can't tell you how long it took me before I, caught on to what that all meant. For me, my pet peeves are the word trolley. Where the heck did that come from? Wait.
Which word was that?
Trolley.
Probably. For probably. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. I was hearing folly, and I'm like, folly seems like an old word, not a new one. But yes, probably.
Probably is one of them. Wait. Kids start every sentence with the word wait. Wait. They could, a conversation hasn't even started yet, and they'll walk up to you and go, wait. That'll be the first word out of their mouth. And then the other one is always. The word always. And I want to just scream, there's an L in that word. It's not O, it's all. Those are the ones. Those are my pet peeves. Let me
tackle those one by one. Okay, so the interesting thing about probably being probably is that's in fast speech, and a natural linguistic tendency, and this is in all languages universally and has led to much language change over time, is towards assimilatory tendencies, which is where we have an ease of articulation that causes sounds that are similar close by to kind of blend together, which is the same reason we say things like miss you rather than miss you. That's assimilation. Now, I'm sure you say miss you, not miss you, but yet you're criticizing very similar processes in the word probably. I'm just saying. The other thing you mentioned was always, saying always.
Always.
Now, where did your L in talk and walk go then?
That's an excellent question.
It died. It died in the 15th century, but I don't hear you crying that you need to find that L. So it's sort of like the T in often versus often. A lot of people say, okay, often is the correct form, not often, but that's the opposite of what you're claiming, right? So sometimes we lose letters, other times we find them, but both are related to these historical processes, usually related to syllable structure that cause changes like that to happen over time. And for every case you can come up with modern English where we've lost a letter, I can come up with in your English where you've also lost a letter. But then that's not really fair because, it still bothers you as a speaker of this language today. And I get that. But what I think I'm trying to get through in the book is our belief that these are somehow bad examples of language, that these are decay, are really not founded on historical evolution of language. Because if we look back in time, I can find 20 examples of the exact same process that brought you to how you're speaking today in history. For every one example you can come up in modern speech, that's the same process. But it's okay to dislike them. It's okay. You don't have to like them. I'm not telling anybody you should go love like, because that's a losing battle. But what I think you should understand is that these features are actually much more complex and sophisticated, and they're much more historically bound than we tend to give them credit for. And it will actually help you come to peace with the features in a way that we don't normally, once you start to understand where they come from and why people use them, because otherwise you just rally against them with no reason for understanding why you hate them so much. It's okay to dislike them, but they're not bad.
You mentioned losing letters, and I was thinking, I lived in the Bronx for a while, so we drop our R's every so often. Kids from New England are dropping their I's. How much do regional accents affect language like this?
Regional accents are very powerful. In fact, a lot of what gave us the norms we have today in modern English came during the 1600s and 1700s in Britain, when there was a mass migration from Scotland, Ireland, and the northern areas of England to London, which had become a cultural capital. And a lot of those features became the norms that we use today. So a great example of that is that we don't say hath or doth anymore. We say has and does. Well, that switch from the TH to the S for third person singular marking was from Northern British dialects, and it came in with the mass migration. R dropping, that perfect example you came up with, also a dialectal feature, probably brought in from some more rural dialects into London in the 1600s as a fledgling tendency. We find it very rarely in that period on words like first and worst that were sometimes written fust, wust. The funny thing is, at that time and into the 1700s, it was claimed as decay. It was claimed as bastardized in vulgar speech. Now, guess what? If a British person drops their R, we love it, right? We think of it as good speech, but that was not something till the 19th century. And those features seem to have been brought in with regional varieties. And we find the same thing here in the United States. Although, on the other hand, with the mass migration and movement that we're experiencing today and the resettlement of populations, we find less regional distinction than we used to.
Valerie Fridland is my guest this morning. The book, Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. There's one part that really stood out to me. There's a quote: "There are college professors out there studying the meaning and function of dude." The etymology of the word dude that you point out, Valerie, is hilarious in the book.
Yes, I think that one is a big surprise. And I constantly remind my son, who is a teenager, every time he dudes me, that he's actually calling me an effeminate dandy, because that was the original meaning of dude in the 1880s. If you called someone a dude, it was not a compliment, and in fact would get you sued or even worse, challenged to a duel. We find records of that in the New York Times where people actually challenged each other to duels or sued them because of being called a dude. It was a grave insult. But it had a lot to do with the clothing of the dude. So in the 1880s, people that were really flashy dressers, particularly in sort of a particular effeminate style, kind of Oscar Wildean sort of people, were called dudes. And then eventually that meaning of being a sharp dresser got removed from the meaning of being an effeminate dandy, and it got picked up by zoot suiters and Mexican-American pachuchos. And that's when the dude became cool, because it was basically associated with much more cool people than trussed up white folks. And that's how dude entered the mainstream as the cool, chill dude we love today.
And I must also point out that we finally learn in your book what the word macaroni means in Yankee Doodle Dandy. I never knew that.
Haven't you wondered that? I remember as a kid thinking it was those little macaronis that I had in my macaroni and cheese and thinking, well, that's weird, but whatever. I was 5. Who cared, right? No one thought too hard about it. But macaroni actually was a word in the 18th century that meant excellent or fashionable. So if something was good, it was macaroni. And this came from some 17th century British young men that had continental airs and used to go over to Italy thinking they were really hot stuff. You know, I won't use the word, but you know what I mean?
Yes,
and they loved macaroni, which was a new dish at the time. And that's how they got started. It started to be called macaronis. And then the word itself just became somebody really fashionable and cool. And it was sung to the Americans by the British to put us down, that they were sticking a feather in their cap and calling us macaroni, which meant you were like this bumbly fool trying to be a British dandy. Calling themselves macaroni. So it's a hysterical history that no 5-year-old has ever figured out that macaroni is a weird thing to be called.
If you drove your parents nuts with the language and the slang you used as a kid, or your kids are driving you nuts with their language and slang, I highly recommend the book. Like Literally, Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. Valerie Fridland, thank you so much for your time this morning. Best of luck with the book. It's a wonderful read.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. And yeah, later, dude.